Ma'am, license and registration, please.
Officer, I just had treatment. I'm not feeling well. I need to get home.
What kind of treatment? Ma'am, your eyes are glassy. Have you taken anything today?
I have cancer. I just finished my session. Please, I just need to get home.
Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle for me. Now.
Officer, please, I can't. I don't have the strength. I just had chemo today.
Ma'am, I'm not asking. Out of the vehicle. Right now.
I can't breathe.
The golden light of a late March afternoon stretched across Woodward Avenue as Bonnie Connor guided her dark blue Toyota Camry through the familiar streets of Detroit. The sun sat low in the sky, painting everything in amber and shadow, the kind of quiet, late afternoon light that made even tired streets look peaceful. It was 4:38 p.m. on a Friday. Spring was barely beginning to show itself, and the air still carried that sharp, biting cold that Michigan refused to let go of until April. Bonnie was 42 years old. She had been an oncology nurse at Detroit General Hospital for 11 years, spending her days caring for patients who were fighting for their lives, holding hands during difficult conversations, administering the very treatments that were now flowing through her own veins. The irony was not lost on her. She spent every working day watching other people battle cancer, and then one morning, 14 months ago, she had found a lump in her left breast during a routine self-examination and discovered she was fighting the same battle herself. She was bald, completely, undeniably bald. The chemotherapy had stripped her of her hair 6 weeks into treatment, and it hadn't grown back yet. She wore no wig, no hat, no scarf. She had stopped hiding it months ago. At first, the baldness had been devastating, another violation on top of the diagnosis, the surgery, the fear. But over time, she had come to see it differently. It was evidence that she was fighting, evidence that she was still alive, a badge of survival that she carried with quiet dignity. Today had been her 14th round of chemotherapy. She had arrived at the infusion center at 9 a.m., sat in the familiar reclining chair, and let the nurses insert the IV line into the portacath that had been surgically implanted in her upper chest 6 months ago. The port was a small, round, flesh-colored device sitting just below her collarbone, designed to make the repeated chemotherapy infusions easier and less painful. It was visible at the neckline of her oversized dark gray hoodie, though most people wouldn't know what it was unless they recognized it. The treatment had taken 4 hours, 4 hours of toxic drugs dripping into her bloodstream, attacking the cancer cells, but also attacking everything else, leaving her exhausted, nauseous, and weak in ways that were difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. By the time the infusion was complete and the nurse removed her IV line at 1:15 p.m., Bonnie could barely keep her eyes open. Her sister, Clara Reed, had driven her to the treatment center that morning, but Clara had a work obligation she couldn't cancel, so Bonnie had insisted on driving herself home. It was only 20 minutes away. She'd done it before, after earlier treatments, when she felt stronger. Today, she felt weaker than usual, but she was stubborn, and she didn't want to be a burden. She had a hospital wristband still on her left wrist, the kind given to outpatient treatment patients, white with black printed text showing her name, date of birth, and treatment information. She hadn't bothered to cut it off. She was wearing her dark gray hoodie, loose and comfortable, the kind of clothing that cancer patients gravitated toward because it was soft and required no effort to put on. The portacath was faintly visible at the neckline. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with a tremor that had become familiar over the past several months, her fingers thin and pale. She was driving carefully, slowly, staying in the right lane, using her signals. She was a careful driver on any day, but today she was acutely aware that her reflexes were slower than normal, that her vision occasionally blurred with fatigue, that she needed to concentrate harder than usual to do something as simple as change lanes. At 4:42 p.m., she passed through an intersection on Woodward Avenue and drifted slightly into the adjacent lane for perhaps 2 seconds before correcting back. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't erratic, it was the kind of minor lane drift that happens to drivers every day, barely noticeable to anyone watching. But Officer Eric Hunt was watching.
Eric Hunt was 26 years old and had been with the Detroit Police Department for 14 months. He was what the department called a rookie, still in his probationary period, still learning the job, still eager to prove himself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, the kind of young man who had always imagined himself in uniform, who had gone through the academy with determination and graduated near the top of his class. He was also, in ways he would never have consciously acknowledged, shaped by unconscious biases that he'd absorbed through his upbringing, through his training, through the culture of policing he'd entered. When he saw a black woman driving alone in the late afternoon with slightly unfocused eyes and a slight lane drift, his first instinct wasn't concern, it was suspicion. He saw the lane drift. He ran her plate. No outstanding warrants, registration current. But something about the way she was driving nagged at him, the slight drift, the way her head seemed to dip forward for a moment before snapping back up, the way she gripped the wheel with what looked like unusual tension. He hit his lights. Bonnie saw the red and blue flash in her rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. Not with guilt, she had done nothing wrong, but with exhaustion. The thought of having to interact with a police officer right now, when she could barely keep her eyes open, when every cell in her body was screaming for sleep, felt like an impossible task. She pulled over immediately, smoothly, onto the shoulder of Woodward Avenue. She put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She did everything right, everything a law-abiding citizen was supposed to do. She waited.
Officer Hunt approached the driver's side window with his flashlight in one hand, even though the late afternoon sun made it unnecessary. It was habit, something drilled into him during training, and it also gave him something to do with his hands while he assessed the situation. He reached the window and looked down at the driver. A black woman, bald, gaunt, pale, heavy-lidded eyes, hands trembling on the steering wheel, sweat on her forehead despite the cool air, an oversized hoodie that hung loosely on a frame that looked like it had lost weight recently. Hunt's training had taught him to assess for signs of impairment: glassy eyes, trembling hands, unusual sweating, disorientation, inability to maintain composure. Every single sign he'd been taught to look for during a DUI stop was present on this woman's face and body. What his training had not adequately prepared him for was the possibility that these same symptoms could indicate something else entirely. That a bald woman with a hospital wristband and a visible medical port on her chest might not be intoxicated at all, but might instead be someone who had just spent 4 hours receiving chemotherapy and was fighting to stay conscious from the residual effects of toxic medication. Hunt didn't see the wristband at first. He didn't see the portacath. He saw what his bias told him to see: a black woman who looked like she was on something. His body camera was recording. The timestamp read 16:42:18. "Ma'am, license and registration, please," Hunt said, his voice professional, but carrying an undertone of suspicion that he probably wasn't aware of. Bonnie looked up at him. Her eyes were heavy, not from drugs or alcohol, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that chemotherapy leaves in its wake. She blinked slowly, trying to focus. "Officer," she said, her voice weak, barely above a whisper, "I just had treatment. I'm not feeling well. I need to get home." She shifted slightly in her seat. Her grip on the wheel loosened. Her head tilted forward just a fraction before she caught herself and straightened. Hunt watched her movements, the slow blink, the slight head dip, the trembling hands, the way she seemed to struggle to form words. Everything about her body language told him what he'd been trained to suspect. "What kind of treatment?" he asked, his tone sharpening, leaning in slightly to get a better look at her face. "Ma'am, your eyes are glassy. Have you taken anything today?" Bonnie felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She was so tired, so depleted, so desperately wanting to just get home and collapse into her bed. And now she had to explain herself to a stranger who clearly didn't believe her. "Chemotherapy," she said, shaking her head slowly. "I have cancer. I just finished my session. Please, I just need to get home." She lifted her left wrist slightly, the hospital wristband catching the afternoon light. Her hand trembled as she held it up. The wristband was clearly visible. Her name, the hospital name, the date, treatment information printed in small black text. Hunt glanced at the wristband for perhaps half a second. His eyes registered it without truly processing it. A hospital wristband could mean anything. People wore them after outpatient visits for minor procedures. It didn't prove she wasn't impaired. It didn't change what he was seeing. He stepped back slightly, his posture shifting from curious to authoritative. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle for me, now." The words hit Bonnie like a physical blow. Step out. She could barely grip the steering wheel. She could barely keep her eyes open. The idea of standing, of moving her legs, of supporting her own body weight felt as distant and impossible as running a marathon. "Officer, please," she said, and now there was fear in her voice, quiet and desperate. "I can't. I don't have the strength. I just had chemo today." Her breathing was becoming labored, not from anxiety, though anxiety was part of it, but from the physical reality of her body's current state. Chemotherapy had compromised her immune system, weakened her muscles, depleted her energy reserves. Standing up from a seated position was genuinely difficult for her on a good day. Today was not a good day. Hunt saw the labored breathing and interpreted it as further evidence of impairment. Someone who was truly just tired from a medical treatment wouldn't be this agitated, wouldn't be breathing this hard, wouldn't be resisting a simple request. "Ma'am, I'm not asking," Hunt said, his voice hardening, his hand moving to his belt in a gesture that was partly habit and partly intimidation. "Out of the vehicle, right now." The body camera captured everything. The angle from Hunt's chest showed Bonnie's face perfectly in the golden afternoon light. It showed her bald head, smooth and vulnerable. It showed her gaunt cheeks, her heavy-lidded eyes, the trembling of her hands. It showed the hospital wristband on her left wrist. It showed the portacath visible at the neckline of her hoodie. It showed every piece of evidence that should have told any reasonable person that this woman was not intoxicated, that she was ill, that she was a cancer patient, that she needed help, not confrontation. Hunt saw none of it, or rather, he saw it all and chose not to believe it. Bonnie made a decision. She would comply. She would get out of the car. She would do whatever this officer needed her to do so she could get home. She didn't have the energy to fight. She didn't have the strength to argue. She just wanted to go home. Okay, I'm getting out," she whispered. "Okay, I'm getting out." She reached for the door handle with a hand that shook so badly she almost missed it on the first try. She managed to push the door open and began the process of pulling herself out of the driver's seat.
It took her longer than it should have. Her legs felt disconnected from her body. Her arms had almost no strength. She gripped the door frame with both hands and pulled, trying to lift herself out of the seat, trying to get her legs under her. Hunt watched her struggle and saw only delay, only non-compliance dressed up as difficulty. "Ma'am, let's go," he said, impatient. "Out of the car." Bonnie got her feet on the ground. She was standing, barely. Her knees were shaking. Her vision was tunneling at the edges, that familiar warning sign that her body was running out of resources. She knew what was happening. 14 rounds of chemotherapy had taught her exactly what her body's limits were, and she was approaching them rapidly. "Please," she said, one hand still gripping the doorframe, the other reaching out slightly as if trying to steady herself against nothing. "I just need a moment. I'm very weak. The chemo—" Her voice trailed off, her grip on the doorframe loosened, her knees buckled, and Bonnie Connor collapsed. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a scream or a theatrical fall. She simply folded, her legs giving out beneath her, her body sliding down against the open car door until she was sitting on the pavement, her back against the side of the Camry, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The hospital wristband caught the late afternoon light as her hand fell limp against the concrete. Hunt stood frozen for a moment, watching. The body camera recorded his stillness, the way he didn't move toward her, the way his hand stayed near his belt, the way his face showed something between confusion and dawning realization. Then he moved, slowly at first, then quickly, kneeling beside her, his hand reaching for her shoulder. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Bonnie's eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She was unconscious, her body having simply shut down from the combined weight of chemotherapy, physical exhaustion, and the stress of the encounter. Hunt grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hunt, badge 2291. I need an ambulance at my location, Woodward and Grand River. Female subject, collapsed, unresponsive, possible medical emergency." His voice on the radio carried a quality it hadn't carried 30 seconds earlier. Something had shifted. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something that sounded like fear. The fear of a rookie officer who was suddenly very aware that something had gone terribly wrong.
The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. To Hunt, it felt like an hour. He knelt beside Bonnie on the pavement, his training finally kicking in past his assumptions. He checked her pulse. It was there, rapid but present. He checked her breathing, shallow but continuous. He looked at her face, really looked at it this time, and saw what he should have seen from the beginning. The bald head, the gaunt frame, the pallid skin, the hospital wristband right there on her wrist, white and clear and unmistakable. He picked up her hand gently and read the wristband properly for the first time. Connor, Bonnie, DOB 03-15-1982, Detroit General Hospital, Oncology, Outpatient Infusion 03-08-2025. Oncology. The word hit him like a punch to the chest. Oncology was cancer. This woman had cancer. She had been at a cancer treatment center today. The treatment she'd told him about, the chemotherapy, it wasn't an excuse, it wasn't a cover story, it was the truth. He looked at the portacath visible at her neckline. He'd seen photos of these in his first aid training. He knew what they were. They were implanted specifically for chemotherapy patients to make it easier to deliver the toxic drugs directly into the bloodstream. This woman had cancer. She had just finished chemotherapy. She had told him the truth. Every single thing she'd said to him in those 30 seconds of conversation had been completely, entirely true, and he had forced her out of the car. The ambulance arrived with a stretcher and immediately took control of the situation. The lead paramedic, a woman named Ann Reed, who had been working emergency medicine in Detroit for 16 years, knelt beside Bonnie and began her assessment with practiced efficiency. "What happened?" Ann asked, not looking up, her hands already checking vitals, her eyes scanning Bonnie's body for information. Hunt opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Traffic stop. She drifted lanes. I pulled her over. She said she'd had chemotherapy. I asked her to step out of the vehicle. She tried to get out, and she collapsed." Ann looked at the wristband, looked at the portacath, looked at Bonnie's bald head and gaunt frame. Then she looked up at Hunt, and her expression carried a weight that made him take a step back. "She told you she'd had chemotherapy," Ann said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you still made her get out of the car?" Hunt said nothing. There was nothing to say. Ann turned back to her patient, calling out instructions to her partner. IV line, saline solution, check blood sugar, check oxygen saturation, prepare for transport. She worked quickly and efficiently, stabilizing Bonnie on the stretcher, wrapping her in a thermal blanket, monitoring her vitals on a portable machine. Bonnie's oxygen saturation was at 91%, low. Her blood sugar was dangerously depleted. Her blood pressure was elevated from stress. Her body temperature was dropping from lying on cold concrete. All of these things were treatable. None of them were life-threatening, as long as she received proper care quickly. As Ann's partner loaded Bonnie onto the stretcher, Ann stood and turned to Hunt. The body camera was still recording. The timestamp showed the encounter had lasted 11 minutes from first contact to ambulance arrival. "Officer," Ann said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge,
That woman is a cancer patient. She just had a 4-hour chemotherapy infusion today. Chemo patients experience extreme fatigue, nausea, weakness, and disorientation after treatment. Those are not signs of intoxication. Those are signs of a person whose body is being poisoned to kill cancer cells. She paused, letting the words settle. The wristband on her wrist says oncology outpatient infusion. The port in her chest is a chemotherapy port. She is bald because the chemo took her hair. Everything about this woman's appearance should have told you exactly what was happening here. And she told you directly. She said she had chemotherapy. Hunt stood silent, the body camera recording every word, every expression. "I hope you think about what just happened here," Anne said quietly, "because when this footage is reviewed, and it will be reviewed, every one of those decisions is going to be examined very closely." She turned and walked back to the ambulance, climbing in beside Bonnie. The doors closed, the sirens activated. The ambulance pulled away from the curb and disappeared down Woodward Avenue, leaving Hunt standing alone on the roadside in the golden afternoon light. He stood there for a long time. The body camera continued to record. The timestamp kept moving, and Eric Hunt stared at the spot where Bonnie Connor had collapsed on the pavement, at the faint smudge of sweat and dust she'd left on the concrete, and felt the weight of what he had done begin to settle onto his shoulders.
Bonnie Connor spent 2 nights in Detroit General Hospital, not because her condition was critical, but because her oncologist, a quiet and meticulous physician named Dr. Kevin Miles, wanted to monitor her closely after the episode of unconsciousness and the extended exposure to cold concrete. The chemotherapy infusion had left her severely depleted. Her white blood cell count was dangerously low, meaning her immune system was essentially non-functional. Lying on cold pavement for several minutes had dropped her core body temperature and introduced bacteria through her skin that her compromised immune system might struggle to fight. Dr. Miles ordered antibiotics, IV fluids, nutritional support, and round-the-clock monitoring. Bonnie woke in her hospital room at 11 p.m. that Friday night, disoriented at first, then gradually remembering. The traffic stop, the officer, the struggle to get out of the car, the feeling of her legs giving way, then nothing, until now. Her sister Clara was sitting beside the bed, her face drawn with worry and barely contained anger. "What happened?" Clara asked gently when she saw Bonnie's eyes open. Bonnie told her, slowly, in fragments, pausing to rest between sentences. The stop, the officer's suspicion, telling him about the chemotherapy, showing him the wristband, being told to get out anyway, trying to comply, collapsing. Clara listened without interrupting. When Bonnie finished, Clara was quiet for a long moment. "We need to report this," Clara said finally. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was a fury that Bonnie recognized. Clara had always been the protective one, the fighter, the one who didn't let things slide. "I know," Bonnie said quietly. The next morning, while Bonnie was still in the hospital, Clara contacted the Detroit Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and filed a formal complaint. She described the incident in detail, including the fact that her sister had clearly communicated her medical condition, had visible medical indicators including a hospital wristband and chemotherapy port, and had been forced to exit the vehicle despite her stated inability to do so safely. She also contacted a civil rights attorney named William Sloan, who had spent 20 years handling police misconduct cases in Michigan. Sloan was known for his thoroughness, his patience, and his ability to build cases that were difficult to argue against in court. Sloan visited Bonnie in the hospital the following Monday. He sat beside her bed, listened to her account of the incident, and asked careful questions. Then he asked to see the body camera footage. "The footage is the key," he told Bonnie. "Everything you've described, the wristband, the port, the conversation, all of it should be on that camera.
If it is, this case is straightforward. The footage was requested through official channels, and the Detroit Police Department provided it within 48 hours, as required by department policy for incidents under internal affairs review. Sloan watched the footage 3 times. Each time he took detailed notes. Each time his expression grew more serious. The footage showed everything. It showed Bonnie in the driver's seat, visibly weak, visibly ill. It showed her telling the officer she had cancer, that she just had chemotherapy. It showed the hospital wristband on her wrist, clearly visible when she lifted her hand. It showed the portacath at her neckline. It showed her struggle to get out of the car. It showed her collapse. It showed the officer standing nearby, watching her fall, not moving to help for several seconds. It showed 11 minutes of interaction in which a rookie officer ignored every piece of evidence that contradicted his initial assumption and forced a cancer patient out of a vehicle she was too weak to safely exit. "This is damning," Sloan told Clara on the phone after reviewing the footage. "There is no version of this story where the officer's actions are justified. She told him, the wristband told him, the port told him, her physical appearance told him. He saw all of it and chose to ignore it." The internal affairs investigation was assigned to Lieutenant Harry Marquez, a 19-year veteran of the department who had a reputation for thoroughness and impartiality. Marquez was not someone who shied away from holding officers accountable when the evidence warranted it, but he was also not someone who made hasty judgments. He believed in examining every angle, every piece of evidence, every possible interpretation before reaching a conclusion. He watched the body camera footage 4 times. He interviewed Officer Hunt. He interviewed the paramedics, including Ann Reed, who provided a detailed medical explanation of how chemotherapy patients present and why Bonnie's symptoms were consistent with post-treatment exhaustion rather than intoxication. He interviewed Dr. Kevin Miles, Bonnie's oncologist, who provided medical records confirming her treatment schedule and the expected physical effects. He interviewed Bonnie herself, gently and carefully, taking her statement while she was still recovering in the hospital. He also pulled Officer Hunt's training records, his performance evaluations, and any previous complaints filed against him. There were no previous complaints. Hunt was 14 months into his career, but his training records showed something notable. His completion records for the department's implicit bias module showed that he had completed the mandatory online course but had scored the minimum passing grade and had not attended any of the optional in-person workshops that expanded on the material. The report compiled every detail. It was thorough, precise, and devastating in its conclusions. The report found that Officer Eric Hunt had failed to recognize a medical emergency despite clear verbal and visual indicators. He had failed to provide duty of care when a citizen expressed a medical condition. He had failed to call for medical assistance when requested. He had used authority to compel a physically compromised individual to perform an action that carried foreseeable risk of harm. And his decision-making throughout the encounter displayed indicators of racial bias, specifically the assumption of criminal behavior based on appearance rather than evidence. The report recommended immediate suspension pending a formal disciplinary hearing.
Officer Eric Hunt was suspended without pay the day the Internal Affairs report was filed. He was called into a meeting with Lieutenant Marquez and his union representative and informed that the department was pursuing formal disciplinary action, up to and including termination. Hunt sat in the conference room at the precinct and listened as Marquez walked through the findings. He watched portions of his own body camera footage on a laptop screen, seeing himself from the outside for the first time, seeing his tone, seeing his posture, seeing the way he'd looked at Bonnie without truly seeing her, seeing the moment she collapsed. He had replayed that moment in his mind dozens of times since it happened, the way her knees buckled, the way she slid down against the car door, the way her hand, with the hospital wristband catching the light, fell limp against the concrete. He had done that. His assumption had done that. His refusal to listen had done that. The body camera footage is going to be reviewed by the media, Marquez told him bluntly. This story is going public. The department is cooperating with the investigation, and we are not going to protect an officer whose actions endangered a civilian's life. Hunt nodded. He had nothing to say. There was nothing to say. The formal disciplinary hearing took place 2 weeks after the suspension. Hunt's union representative made the standard arguments. The officer had followed his training regarding signs of impairment. The traffic stop had been initiated for a legitimate reason. The situation had escalated because the driver had been slow to comply with lawful requests. The department's response was simple. They played the body camera footage. 11 minutes of video that showed a bald cancer patient wearing a hospital wristband and a chemotherapy port, telling an officer exactly what was wrong with her and being forced out of a vehicle anyway. 11 minutes that ended with her collapsing on the pavement. The hearing board deliberated for less than an hour. Officer Eric Hunt was terminated from the Detroit Police Department effective immediately. His badge and service weapon were confiscated. His access to department systems was revoked. His 14-month career was over. The termination letter cited failure to recognize a medical emergency, failure to provide duty of care, inappropriate use of authority, and evidence of racially biased decision-making. It noted that the officer's actions had directly led to a medical emergency and had endangered a life of a civilian. The body camera footage with faces redacted was released to the media as part of the department's commitment to transparency. The video went viral within hours. Millions of views, thousands of comments. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Medical professionals expressed outrage. The hashtag trending across social media was simple and direct. The story became what these stories always become when there is undeniable video evidence, a national conversation about bias, about assumptions, about the gap between what officers are trained to see and what they actually choose to see. William Sloan filed the federal lawsuit on Bonnie's behalf 3 weeks after the termination. The lawsuit named Officer Eric Hunt personally and the city of Detroit as defendants, alleging violations of Bonnie's constitutional rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments, racial discrimination under federal civil rights statutes, and negligence resulting in medical harm. The city's legal team reviewed the body camera footage and the internal affairs report and made a decision quickly. There was no version of this case that they could defend in court. A jury would see a bald cancer patient in a hospital wristband being forced out of a car and collapsing. There was no argument, no legal theory, no framing that could make that footage look like anything else than what it was. Settlement negotiations began within a month. They concluded 6 weeks later. The settlement amount was not publicly disclosed, but sources within the city attorney's office indicated it was $7 million. The settlement included a formal written apology from the Detroit Police Department to Bonnie Connor, a commitment to mandatory in-person implicit bias training for all officers, a requirement that Hunt's body camera footage be incorporated into the department's training curriculum, and enhanced protocols for officers to call for medical assistance when a civilian reports a medical condition during any encounter. The Foundation's first initiative was a partnership with the Detroit Police Department to create a training program specifically focused on recognizing medical conditions during traffic stops and other police encounters. The program used real case studies, including Bonnie's own, and involved medical professionals explaining how various conditions present and why symptoms that might look like impairment actually indicate serious illness.
Bonnie Connor finished her chemotherapy treatment 4 months after the traffic stop. Her final infusion was on a Tuesday afternoon in July, and when the nurse removed the IV line for the last time, Bonnie sat in the reclining chair for a long moment, breathing quietly, letting the reality of it settle over her. She was done. The treatment was complete. The cancer, as of her most recent scans, showed no evidence of recurrence. She was in remission. Her hair began growing back slowly over the following weeks, fine, soft wisps at first, then gradually thickening, curling slightly in a way it never had before. Dr. Miles told her this was common after chemotherapy, that the hair that grew back was often different from what had been there before, new growth, changed but alive. She went back to work at Detroit General 6 weeks after her final treatment. Her colleagues welcomed her back with a quiet celebration in the break room, nothing elaborate, just cake and coffee, and the kind of warm, genuine relief that comes from watching someone you care about survive something terrible. Bonnie resumed her work as an oncology nurse with a perspective that had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. She had always been compassionate with her patients, always understanding of the fear and exhaustion and helplessness that cancer brought. But now she understood it from the inside. She knew what it felt like to sit in that reclining chair. She knew what it felt like to drive home afterward, barely conscious, fighting to keep her eyes on the road. She knew what it felt like to have your body betrayed by the very treatment that was supposed to save it. And she knew what it felt like to have that vulnerability dismissed by someone with authority. She became an advocate, not just through the Connor Foundation, but in her daily life. She spoke at medical conferences about the intersection of chronic illness and racial bias. She testified before a Michigan state committee examining police accountability. She appeared on news programs, calm and articulate, telling her story without dramatics, letting the facts speak for themselves. Every time she spoke publicly, she said the same thing at the end, the thing that mattered most, the thing she wanted people to understand. "I told him the truth," she would say. "I showed him the evidence. I was wearing it. It was on my body, in my wrist, visible to anyone who looked, and he didn't believe me. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because his assumptions were louder than the evidence. That's the problem. That's what we have to fix." For Eric Hunt, the months after his termination were difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't find work in law enforcement. His termination for bias-related misconduct followed him everywhere. He applied to departments in neighboring counties, in other states. The answer was always the same once they reviewed his record. He found work eventually in private security, a position that paid significantly less than his police salary and carried none of the authority or purpose he'd felt in uniform. He did the job quietly and without complaint, but something fundamental had changed in him. He watched the news coverage of his own case. He read the comments online, the outrage, the calls for accountability, the stories from other people who had been dismissed or mistreated because of assumptions about who they were. He read about Bonnie Connor's foundation and the work it was doing. And he thought about that afternoon on Woodward Avenue, the golden light, the dark blue Toyota Camry, the bald woman in the gray hoodie who had told him the truth and whom he had not believed. He thought about the moment she collapsed, the way her body simply gave up, folding quietly onto the pavement, the hospital wristband catching the light. He thought about all the things he should have seen, all the things he chose not to see.
Some nights, lying in his apartment in the dark, he would replay the encounter in his mind. Not the version he'd seen through his own eyes that afternoon, the version filtered through his assumptions and his training and his biases, the version from the body camera, the version that showed him from the outside, the version that showed exactly what he had done and exactly why. Lieutenant Harry Marquez continued his work in internal affairs, bringing the same thoroughness and impartiality to every case that came across his desk. He used Bonnie Connor's case as a reference point in his work, not as an example of exceptional misconduct, but as an example of how ordinary assumptions could lead to extraordinary harm. Hunt wasn't a monster,
Marquez told a colleague once, late in the evening, after reviewing another case file. He was a rookie who hadn't learned to see past his assumptions. That's what makes it dangerous. It's not the monsters we need to worry about. It's the people who think they're doing their job correctly while they're causing harm. Sergeant Chen, who had been involved in the community policing initiatives that had preceded the incident, incorporated the case into her training programs. She showed the footage. She asked officers to identify the signs they should have seen. She asked them to consider why those signs might have been dismissed. She watched their faces as they watched the video, and she saw the discomfort, the shifting, the dawning recognition that what Hunt had done was not as far from what they might do as they wanted to believe. The conversation continued. In police academies and medical schools and courtrooms and living rooms across the country, people talked about what had happened on Woodward Avenue on a Friday afternoon in March, about a bald woman in a gray hoodie who had told the truth and not been believed, about a rookie officer who had seen what his bias told him to see instead of what was actually in front of him, about a body camera that recorded everything and changed nothing in the moment, but changed everything afterward, and about the question that hung over all of it, the question that Bonnie Connor raised every time she spoke publicly, the question that had no easy answer but demanded to be asked. If a bald cancer patient in a hospital wristband with a chemotherapy port visible on her chest telling an officer directly that she had just finished treatment, then who would be believed? When would the evidence be enough, and what had to happen before assumptions stopped overriding reality? The body camera blinked its red light. It recorded everything, and in the end, the truth it preserved was simple. Eric Hunt had seen a black woman and made assumptions. Those assumptions had overridden everything she told him, everything her body showed him, everything the evidence in front of him demanded he recognize. And a woman who was already fighting for her life had nearly lost it, not because of cancer, but because a man with a badge decided she wasn't worth believing. The camera didn't lie. The footage didn't change. And justice, when it finally came, was measured not in seconds, but in consequences that would echo long after the golden light of that March afternoon had faded from Woodward Avenue.